Okay, thanks everybody for listening again. This is another episode of Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White, and today we are talking to someone that I've been eager to talk to ever since I read his book. His name is Ethan Chorin. I should have asked you actually how you pronounce your name.
Chorin.
Chorin, right? Um, and who recently came out with a book entitled Benghazi! Exclamation point, a new history of the fiasco that pushed America and its world to the brink. But he's also written many other books on Libya and on other topics as well. And I just really wanted to talk to him because after all of the controversy and conspiracy theories over Benghazi over the past few years, I really wanted to find a book like this that gives a historical explanation to it. So, first of all, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
And can you tell us what is it that got you into this subject to begin with?
Middle East history and politics, or
Yeah, yeah,
Benghazi.
definitely.
Um, Actually, I'm not quite sure. I think it came through languages. I was always really interested in foreign languages, and when I was in college, I had this idea that somehow that I wanted thought the expected thing to do was to go to med school or something, and I found myself in all these science classes, and on the side, I took an Arabic class, which I loved, and that sort of gradually that led to taking Hebrew and other things and Middle East politics and history, and I found myself having more credits than in that than anything else. And I had a professor who suggested a summer fellowship in Tunisia, and that basically sealed the deal for me. And it's yeah. So and I've been back and forth ever since. Even though I took some detours into other areas, the Middle East has always been my focus.
I always like to hear that too, that someone got into history via language because that happened with me too. I spent a year in Mexico when I was 16 years old and fell in love with the culture, and you can really understand the history better if you can actually speak to the people too.
Sure. And I remember reading something recently. I'm sure it's been said many times before, but really when you learn another language, and I'm sure you understand this as well, when you learn another language, it's really like you have a different persona and you have a completely different world view into the logic and sensitivities of another culture. And I argue in the book that, in fact, a lot more of this would be really helpful to the United States. A lot of military people and Peace Corps and other people have taken other sort of structural experiences abroad, and that really changes one's perspective on things dramatically. And I think very much for the better.
Oh, absolutely. And when you've traveled to the region too and lived among the people and you eat with them, that's what I always tell people when they travel abroad. They ask me, oh, since I've traveled abroad, say, well, what should I know? I say, well, food is the key to people's heart. And there's other ways of addressing it, I think, music, right? Maybe. But if you will accept the food that someone wants to give you and then you share with them, then there's so many other doors that can open.
Absolutely. I know Ambassador Stevens, who was killed in the Benghazi attack, would say that often. That
No kidding.
you need to
Oh.
sit down and eat with people before you can understand, get build that bond.
Well, and there's so much that we could talk about that was happening before September 11th, 2012, but I did want to include, I wanted to ask you, what was he like?
We had an unusual connection in the sense that we were colleagues for several years and sort of pursued. He was 10 years in the service longer than I was or more. So we were at very different levels, but we had very similar experiences growing up in Northern California and the North Africa introduction to the Middle East, etc. And we were introduced by a senior colleague who um, thought that Chris was looking into the possibility of serving in Libya, and uh, I had been one of a small group of people who'd been sent out to sort of to try to help set up the proto embassy there in 2004. So we had conversations around that and built this rapport around Libya and sort of out of the way places in the region, and I got him to know him through those conversations, and we had been connect, connected via those emails for many years, and would talk about various issues, specifically Libya, but I didn't meet him in person until very late in this process. I mean, actually, less than a year before the attack. So we knew what each other were doing, but we did not have it was in some ways it was a typical foreign service relationship where you sort of sometimes intersect with people back at the home base, but a lot of it's email. Anyway, that's a long
No.
introduction to I mean, my impressions of him, of course, I really think he was a very courageous and person and principled person. And as I explained in the book, I think that he saw into, it's almost like he had a look behind the screen at what was going on various levels of U.S. government, both overt and covert policy, and was almost trying to grapple with all of this, make sense of it, and do the principled thing, and in an impossible situation. So I felt in the course of writing this book, I had, of course, various, I had this sort of direct experience with the attack, which you may ask me about later. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the process of going back over the last 10 years and trying to process what I was thinking and some of the things that I noticed but didn't quite put into place at the time, and trying to put myself specifically in the position of people that came to be principal players in this, like Stevens, of course, and some of his colleagues, and various people back in Washington, and even and also Hillary Clinton, and Obama. That each of these people were looking at this event, not directly related to how it to the and how to deal with it, but within their multiple overlapping constraints, political mostly, and their behavior, taken from an outside perspective, looked to many people as bizarre or nonsensical or even outrageous. But if you try to put their actions in context, you start to understand a bit better what was going on, why the reaction was so severe, and how it spiraled out of control.
Right.
And
And
go back to, I think your question was about Chris
yeah.
Stevens.
Yeah.
I think that the book was an exercise in trying to kind of connect the dots over both a shorter kind of in-person experience with him at a very stressful time, and a longer period of our both getting to know Libya and what was going on there, and trying to develop a sense of what really should be American priorities there in terms of making sense of it, and both helping the Libyan people, but also advancing American interests.
And I think it's so important for listeners to understand that you start the book off as it's actually during the attack, right? And you're actually in a hotel room, a ways away from where it's happening.
Yes.
And so you're actually there at the time, but then also you get into the timeline of the history of Libya, which I think is so important too. That when you did that, I realized, okay, so the broader historical context is going to be conveyed here too. The history of Libya in the 20th century in particular, the rise of Gaddafi, and then how the United States dealt with him, how he kind of postured as well with oil wealth and everything. But then how things changed after 9/11, and we have this kind of rapprochement with him. And you and Stevens are there well before the Arab Spring, even, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I was there from 2003 to 2006, and he came in 2007.
And you were over in Benghazi, right?
I was based in Tripoli. The setup there was very similar to the one that was in Benghazi at the time of the attack, in the sense that there was not a formal embassy. It was at the time it was a liaison office, which is sort of, as you know, there are a series of sort of ordered series of officialness of diplomatic posts, and this was kind of like an outpost.
Right. Did you
The
visit?
striking thing for me was that, of course, that at the time was that even though the assumption was that Gaddafi, an omnipresent dictator, had full power to protect us, and it was in his interest to do so, and therefore, we didn't really have much security at all. And there were very similar kind of increasing anxieties about the fact that, in fact, there were people out there that wanted to disrupt their relationship with the United States, and if they wanted to do that, the best place to hit us would be exactly where we were hanging out with guards in slippers and who were, prone to taking naps, our first line of defense.
Yeah, all those different groups you get into are so important, and I think that's why so many people didn't understand what was going on after the attacks in 2012, right? Because you talk about the LIFG, you talk about Gaddafi, of course, you talk about this new government that's it's transitioning even before Gaddafi's officially overthrown and murdered, and these rebel factions. But there's also this connection to Afghanistan and to Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. Uh, and I've gone through the book a couple of times, and I realized this would be a great um, book to use in a class because it really is telling the broader history of the Middle East in the 20th century too.
That was my intention, but the of course the other interesting thing and frustrating thing about this topic is that it's become so toxic that I think
Yeah.
that this, how do you present this in a way that you're saying that, okay, I'm trying to do something a little well, very, different here in terms of balance and investigating causes and also effects of this one event, while asking the readers to put aside their prejudices against the word Benghazi, which I think for a lot of people either incites them to immediate other arguments or drives them into a corner and says, I don't want to deal with this. So, one of the reasons I tried to get that, I had the first feeling like I had to write this book somewhere around 2014, 2015, and it took me 4 years to find a publisher. It was rejected something like 48 or 50 times.
Wow.
And there would be this initial interest, and then people would back off and say, well, nobody wants to really, American public does not want to buy another book about Benghazi. But of course, it's been, the existing material has been so polarizing and charged that, who could blame them in a way?
I think to a degree it's important to include all that information that you have in there, um, because if somebody opens the book up and they get confused by all the different acronyms and all the places and people, then if they approach it with humility, they can realize, oh, it's not so simple. At the very least, they can walk away with knowing that, and then they can use it as a reference material because you point out very astutely that after Benghazi, the way in which it's used, that permeates so much of our political situation today.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
it's incredible. Could you talk about, I'm interested to see, um, I mean, a lot of different things, but you just recently came out with an article in Salon. Can you talk about what that was about?
Well, I mean, that emerged from the fact that uh, for the 10th anniversary, the book was actually pegged to the 10th anniversary of the attack, and
Mhm.
during at that period, there was virtually no mention in the broad mainstream media about Benghazi. I mean, it was almost as if both conservatives and people on the left, just no mention, and it was striking because regardless
Yeah.
of think of it, this was a major event, and there were people, and both sides had used the "Remember Benghazi, we're going to find who did this and bring them to justice." All of that stuff was a mantra for years and years, and yet we still, here we are with this thing that nobody knows what to do with. So let's try to forget about it. And I argue in the book also that part of the reason that Benghazi sort of uh, snuck into this liminal space is that neither side really wants to has any use for it politically. The left doesn't want to hear it because they're afraid on I think some very innate level that it will revive itself and that just invite more and more criticism. And the right was was criticized for overreach,
Yeah.
and I think used it for maximum purpose. Um, so
How do you boil this down to people? My imagine when I was reading this, I'm thinking this guy has is probably approached by people always since you were there at the time. And I mean, you were interviewed right when you came off the plane, when you returned, even a week later, right? How do you boil this down to the average person, let alone on television?
yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that point. I mean, it was very difficult. I mean, when I came back from Benghazi, it was 8 days later I had one of my colleagues decided to stay in Benghazi for a few more days for various complicated reasons, and I was waiting for him in Istanbul. And by the time we got back, and at that point, I remember I was was trying to calm my nerves by swimming laps back and forth in this little bay. And the FBI called, and I remember having a long conversation with them, and then but in which the all this stuff that became so public later, all of the controversial elements just didn't appear in that conversation. I wasn't asked if there was a protest or how did it start or what did I think actually happened there. And then by the time I got back to the States, this controversy was in full, almost, it was certainly very visible. And the Wall Street Journal called up and asked me what I thought of the connection with this anti-Islamic video that was in play, which again requires a lot of explanation as to how that fit in. And I said, I have no, this is the first time I've really heard of that video.
Yeah.
So it was just very surprising. The world that I was like wandering into a totally different universe. And I was also shell shocked. I mean, at the time I was on sort of I was supposed to be promoting my previous book on the origins of the Libyan revolution that had come out literally a couple of days before.
Hmm.
And I just didn't want to talk about, part of me wanted to talk about the book and all of that, but I did not want to talk about Benghazi, in part because I realized at that point that this was a highly sensitive issue, and anything that I actually said and thought that anything that much of the stuff that I could say was going to be inflammatory, or at least perceived to be, and I did not want to
Right.
be in that. So I took a step back and tried to sort of protect myself. If you see like videos of me when I first was being interviewed, I think I look shell shocked. I
Mm.
mean, so that took a long time to get over. And by the time I sort of collected my thoughts, I became obsessed with trying to figure out, to bridge those experiences. Like I and various other witnesses that I knew at the time, all of us had a different piece of the sort of external ambiance around the attack. I was on the phone with the mission as it started and had been sort of tipped off beforehand that something was going on there. So we called, and I was talking to somebody else that I had spoken with earlier in the day, one of Ambassador Stevens' security people, and there were other diplomats, Westerners who I'd known, who were actually having dinner not far, within a sight range of the mission, who had perfect, could answer many of these questions. Collectively, we felt, we had a pretty good idea of what happened, if not exactly who did it. So it was very bizarre, this notion that there could be such confusion for so long about very basic aspects of this story just struck us all as lunacy. But you could, again, if you understand where the history and the context of that attack politically back in the States and its connections to efforts to manage the aftermath of 9/11 and and particularly the political sensitivities around the war on terror and which side of the political universe was protecting us and which was deficient, then you start to understand why the Obama administration reacted the way it did, and why the conservative and why the Republicans reacted the way they did. And it's a dynamic. So each side, of course, believes that it's completely on the moral high ground and attacking the other. But and there are differences in sort of the tenor of the attacks of the participation, but both sides contributed to this dynamic. I could have draw the analogy to a very dysfunctional married couple where both sides really want to kill each other in some way, and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. That's the goal is not whatever they're arguing about. It's to undermine the other.
And of course, it doesn't help that it's happening in an election year, just about 2 months before.
Absolutely. I mean, as I go into, I tried in that Salon article that you mentioned to sort of boil down the essentials of the argument of the book and explain where I think what the critical ingredients were for the explosiveness of the scandal. I mean, there were all kinds of things that normally, if they'd happened independently at a different time, would not have resulted in this blowout. But the combination of those factors, which include what you just said, that the election was right around the corner, the uh, it was an ambassador who was killed. It was the anniversary of 9/11. I mean, all of those elements, you couldn't create this kind of a setup if you tried, almost. And I also argue that some people may have actually been trying, but that's a separate story also. But on top of that, there's this lengthy and sort of deepening political dynamic between the right and the left, which has been focused since 9/11 on national security and terrorism. And I think that's been sort of like a focal point. It's something in which all of these other issues that are triggering for the right and the left can be sort of folded into. And if you talk about this, you're also implicitly talking about other things, whether it's immigration or, even a variety of other sort of social issues that this can be a proxy for.
Yeah.
So you're not just fighting about who's right and wrong on terror. You're fighting about the whole thing, the different identity politics on right and left.
Oh, sure.
And I do think, and then there's a sensitive topic in there about whether the Obama administration actually told the American public what it knew when it knew it. And there
Right.
I argue, and this is a controversial topic which wins me no friends on
On the Democrat side. Yeah.
don't win me many friends on both sides. But it's very clear that there was an effort and I think this context is really important, that the Obama administration and the Democrats more broadly felt besieged and attacked and abused by the right, and developed these coping mechanisms that were, I argue, at the very least, very counterproductive, which
Yeah.
is try to sort of escape. It's sort of like I made this analogy between sort of Tom and Jerry, where there's the cat and the mouse, and one side's nature is to sort of pursue, and the other is to cope with that by being clever and escaping. And I think and I explain in detail why I think that the Obama administration, even if it didn't have the intent to deceive, and I don't think that it did, that ultimately trying to escape the issue of whether this was tied to Al Qaeda or its proxies uh, was an important factor here, because it created this sense of doubt in the minds of the general public that the Republicans exploited. I mean, I think they were right. People were right to ask questions. Why more
Yeah.
information wasn't forthcoming, and this created this opportunity for people to create conspiracy theories based on that one. Here's this big doubt, and of course that must mean that the government is hiding X, Y, and Z other things from us, and we can and it just started to take off. And then of
Yeah.
course there's the whole issue of the status of the development of social media, which I interviewed a number of data scientists, and people were studying trends in social media, and they were saying that actually this was a key moment in the development. That time in the fall of 2012 was kind of like the activation moment for the polarization, the sort of penetration and mechanism whereby social media could take a piece of feedstock or a news and then turn it into a polarizing to polarize it and push people
Sure.
into silos, etc. So you had that third element there, which I think was also critical. And if any of
Right.
those things weren't happening, you probably wouldn't have had the blowout that you did.
Right. Gosh, yeah, there's so many things that come to mind as you say those things, because I know over the years teaching here at Marshall, I've been here for this is my 17th year. All of a sudden, after 2012, especially 13, 14, 15, you start to see a lot more students bringing it up too. And they want to know answers. Why was there a stand down order? These are the kinds of questions they come up with. And I try and tell students, you should ask, was there one? Don't start with the assumption or the assertion from one side. And so I would have them read the congressional, the different reports that they came up with, and but they were watching 13 hours, or they were watching interviews with the survivors and of the raid, and they were taking what they had to say as if it was gospel. So I wonder if we could kind of look into, first of all, how is the messaging kind of flawed? Because that's what you're talking about right now, right? With Susan Rice, for example. She was the one who was tasked with coming forward and explaining what was going on, what led to Benghazi. Can you talk about that first?
The what okay, so there was in the days in the days immediately after the attack, of course, from Washington's perspective, what you have to also see what was going on from DC, which was early in the afternoon there'd been a violent protest that morphed into basically an attack on the US embassy in Cairo. So this is, and as nightfall was coming in Benghazi, there was this concern among particularly the diplomats back in Tripoli that Chris Stevens and his team might be somewhat, or they were exposed to some aftermath of this attack, that other people, that there would be a copycat effect. And I think that's where you had the question of, were these two events linked? And I think the natural assumption, if you knew nothing else about the situation, was that, okay, there was this big attack and big event in Cairo, and it was followed by this attack in Benghazi, so they're connected. And I think there was the other issue here is that we really didn't have, and this came out very clearly in the days and weeks and months, et cetera, afterward, we really had very little understanding what was going on in Benghazi. And ultimately, part of the problem, what part of the cause of the success of the attack was that we were allied with groups whose motives we really didn't understand. And you had people in militias that were connected to some of these extremist groups that should have no business protecting a U.S. facility. But that also is there are some reasons for that, which I go into. But it created obviously a huge gap in our ability to understand what was happening. So back in DC, you had this two problems. One was the sort of the bias of the situational bias, that we think that this was, that these two events may be directly connected, and there must have been a protest that evolved into an attack there, or that's a likely proposition. But then you didn't have any supporting evidence. You had no way. I think a lot of it is sort of bureaucratic inefficiency and crossed wires. That you had this large CIA presence that seemed to understand certain elements of what was going on, and then you had the State Department group that was sort of separate from them, and you had analysts back in DC that weren't really talking to one another, and it took quite some time for their field data to percolate up to Washington. But by that point, when some of this stuff was a little more clear, the Obama administration had already basically come out with, by default, an explanation that this was an event that was sparked by not an intentional attack, but more of a sort of a broad public outrage at a video that was produced in the United States.
Right. Okay.
If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And of
So,
course, Obama had also in the White House, or in the Rose Garden, right, had not called it a terrorist attack, but said it was an act of terror.
yeah, and it's very clear. I mean, you look at, and there are a lot of people journalists on the left that just remarked the obvious, that the White House was really trying not to talk about this. They just ducked, as the quote from the Washington Post was, they were ducking the question. So you can understand why they would want to duck the question, but at some point you've got, as the bureaucracy sort of catch up, and as a little bit more information comes from witnesses and things like this, or at least official witnesses, you've got a conflict there. So what do you do with it? And then you've got the election still looming in the background.
Yeah.
And but one of the striking things for us, the people who were not official U.S. officials at the time, but were outside the compound and sort of partial witnesses to all of this, is that nobody really reached out and asked us any of these questions. I mean, this came up in the Senate hearings, as well as, and it led to this, one of the major sort of memes of the whole thing is Secretary Clinton saying, "What difference does it make that this
Yeah.
and this was going on?" Which, yes, was taken out of context, but one part of the question there was, why didn't the State Department actually ask directly the witnesses what they thought? And
Mm.
that included us. And I think that's a very valuable. I mean, of course, Clinton's response was that this was that they didn't want to interfere in an official criminal investigation. And you also have to take a look at what was going on with Clinton, in the sense that, I mean, I personally feel, I did interview her for this book, and I do feel that she had a sense of she knew she knew quite a bit, but was trapped by this political situation, in the sense that, on the one hand, she knew the right wing attacks were coming, and at the same time, her job was to be loyal to the to Obama administration. So whatever she personally felt, or whatever information she was getting about what was going on the ground, she had to, as did everybody else, including Ambassador Rice, to essentially, go along with the communications program. I mean, there's nothing striking about that. It's just that this then sets you up for the political conflict to come. That all of these after it's shown that, in fact, this was a terrorist attack, regardless of how far it was planned in advance. Here you've got these officials that were all basically in sync at some point with the president and his immediate staff on this story that proved to be false.
Right. And the story that you're talking about is false is what?
The idea that this was sort of an amorphous, that the attack was somehow what was a general protest linked to
Right.
this hate video that then morphed into a violent attack. I mean, the critical thing about that is intentionality, right?
Yeah.
If it's a mob event, mob anger at the United States in general, you can't, there's no specific perpetrator, and certainly
Right.
it's not an Al Qaeda attack, and that's I think what the major concern there was.
And it is an Al Qaeda linked attack.
Well, there's no question in my mind that it was an Al Qaeda linked attack, and there were various intelligence reports beforehand that became public, that are in the public domain, where it's very clear that the United States had determined that Al Qaeda was not going to wanted to infiltrate and influence the political situation in Libya, but was not going to do it frontally and visibly. They were going to use proxies, so that they were not. So what they were doing was not immediately visible to the
Right.
outside world. And in those reports, Ansar al-Sharia, the group that was ultimately pointed at by the United States as the perpetrators of the attack, was identified as the group that Al Qaeda was relying on to advance this strategy. So there's no huge mystery. I mean, the frustrating thing about all of this is that, there's still debate about these things. But for a lot of all of this stuff, there are a lot of answers to many of the questions that people had and still have about Benghazi. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to sort of take them and get within the context of all of this, explain why there was this impression of stand down orders, and why there was this delay, and why the Obama administration was so interested in trying to sort of distance itself from this terror connection at that time, and to develop the pattern of that. I mean, that this was the Obama reaction to the Benghazi attack was very much in line with its reaction to other events that had occurred since the start of his presidency, where really the Middle East and this whole terror issue, and Obama was elected certainly in part as a rebuke of the Bush policies in the Middle East, right? And he wanted
Yeah.
to distance us, America, from all of that. I think part of the issue there was also that Obama felt, that the urge to, I think in a very good way, to try to solve a few other problems. But the problem there is, with respect to Iran and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, etc. But the problem and the reaction to the Arab Spring. But the problem is that you really can't. It's not a situation where you can pick and choose in the Middle East which conflicts you want to try to resolve, because they're all interconnected. So
Yeah.
the fact that we went into Libya without with this very admirable goal of trying to protect the citizens of Benghazi from a flattening or a genocidal action by Gaddafi, was, you can understand the reasons for that, but it can't be done half-heartedly. It can, as Secretary Gates warned on numerous occasions beforehand, that this was, the United States we have a number of wars going on in Afghanistan, Iraq still, etc. And we don't do reconstruction and state building well. And
Yeah.
if we can't do it, we shouldn't go in. We shouldn't go in there. I think there's some middle ground there that we could have done a much better job. Libya was sort of exceptional in the sense that here you've got a country that's physically very geographically very large and strategic, but is also has a very small population, and generally people had been insulated from a lot of the anti-Americanism elsewhere in the region. Um, and of course, those were some of the arguments that Stevens and others used to push for the intervention to begin with. But it also means that the cost of it's not an Iraq situation in the sense that you're really talking about the equivalent of like 2 or 3 Houstons,
Mm.
if you look at it that way. And it's sort of they're all concentrated mainly on the population's concentrated on the coast. And if
Mm.
you went in there and you had a plan, you're not facing the chaos and the sectarian divisions, the rest of it that permeate the rest of the region. You really could get a better handle on it with fewer resources. But we not only did we not put fewer resources, the amount of attention that we invested in how to manage the post-intervention environment and assistance was just minuscule. I mean, you're talking about millions as opposed to billions or trillions, as the counter has racked up in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan post-intervention expense.
And you also talk about how the kind of minuscule response to Libya is related to our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan too, right? Because we have this rapprochement sort of with Gaddafi. He gets rid of his weapons of mass destruction. That's when you and Stevens first go over there, and as you say, your job is to be kind of a liaison with American businesses, right? And
Mm.
you can't. But there should be a much bigger staff to do something like that. But
Yeah, it's basically me, and I was my job was sort of to represent both the State Department and the Department of Commerce, and in both, and I had one assistant. And in for example, Egypt, you would have, or any other sort of major a country with a major U.S. commercial interest, you'd have a team of at least 5, perhaps 10 people working to try to process the requests coming from both state and commerce. But we just didn't have the resources to do it at that point. And of course, it was also at that point a very new relationship. But um, yeah, and also the fact the fact that you know I go into the sort of the sort of personal slash professional aspect of this, and that I mean, I was in a job. I just joined the Foreign Service. I'd had a prior career and experience in various relevant areas, and spoke Arabic. But I was new to the Foreign Service, and the reason that I was sent to Libya for this job that I thought was fantastic. I mean, I really. How exciting is this? I get to be one
yeah,
of the first people to jump into Libya that's been off the U.S. grid for more than 20 years, and but there really wasn't that much of an interest within the State Department in that environment, and partly because of the whole history of the relationship with Gaddafi and the fact that here was this guy who was basically most people thought was the responsible for the Lockerbie bombing in 1988. Of course, he was,
yeah.
but there were some other elements in there as well, um, and there was just this very bad taste, I think, for that. Um,
I'm curious. Have you read Wayne Smith's memoirs about his time in Cuba, by
I
chance?
haven't.
Only I just brought it up only because he has kind of a similar situation to you. He was actually there in '57 and then left after we closed the U.S. embassy in one around there or '60. But then he came back when we're trying to transition to having relations again. So he opened up the U.S. interest section there in the late '70s, and so the kind of differences between the two and how we're trying to have a new relationship with Cuba back then. That's what his memoir is really about. It's about that transition period under Carter, and then he leaves disillusioned under Reagan in the early '80s. But I had a chance to meet him a few years ago, and he actually came here and spoke to Marshall. But it's kind of a similar situation because Cuba was a pariah because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And we're trying to open up again, but the difficulties of doing that were apparent.
But it was. I'll definitely get it.
Yeah.
The I think part of the problem is, well, again, I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that the U.S. foreign policy is not. We have a short attention span,
Yeah.
so often policy is made. Of course, you want to act with the best possible information, but you wind up, the more divorced the high levels of government advisors and policymakers are from the professionals. The people in the military, the foreign service officers, the intelligence agencies. You're you're going to be prone to make the similar kinds of mistakes for largely political motivations. And as you referenced before, the Libya case was a reaction. Without the Iraq War, we wouldn't have been in Libya or
Mm.
trying to reconcile with Gaddafi in 2003.
Hmm.
Gaddafi offered particularly for the neocons, a kind of a redemption of sorts, or a promise of better things to come. All of the things that were not happening in Iraq, the contracts for U.S. companies, the weapons of mass destruction, discovery and dismantlement, and the win for democracy were not happening. But Gaddafi was willing to play that game.
Yeah.
Gave up his sort of pseudo weapons of mass destruction. He did have chemical weapons stocks, but which we also left alone until the intervention after the 2011 intervention.
Oh, I didn't know. Yeah.
Team that was sent in to scramble. We knew it was there, but there was a team that had to sort of scramble to come and dismantle these things. Well,
Hmm.
this should have been done a long time ago. So yeah, so Gaddafi and Gaddafi's reformation could serve the purpose of saying that okay, intimidation, facing down the region's dictators actually paid off in terms of democracy promotion. The problem there, which is interesting for the Benghazi attack, is that the United States after 9/11 had gone out and basically picked up and in conjunction with this process of trying to reconcile with Gaddafi, had picked up a bunch of Al Qaeda leaders who were Libyans and brought them back to Gaddafi for torture and interrogation. And this created, that was in service to the war on terror, right? But after no one foresaw the Arab Spring coming up a few years later, and at that point, the question, the fact that there was this, I think part of there had been a process of trying to take these radicals and rehabilitate them and allow them to sort of or create a situation in which they could coexist, or at least not threaten the Gaddafi regime. But once the Arab Spring came and started to overturn all of that, you had
Mm.
these past relationships and the flipping of both Gaddafi and the radicals. All these people were mixed together, and we didn't know who was, we couldn't tell whose loyalties were to whom. And I think that's ultimately the root of the Benghazi attack, because we were we were sort of compromised in a whole number of areas, and all of that, and yet we still hadn't figured out. We almost bought our own story that first we flipped Gaddafi. Okay, now he's flipping back to the other side, but we've got these other people that we flipped along with him that were radicals, but are now professing to be Democrats, and
Yeah.
they're gonna help us. And the idea that's just a spectacular idea. I mean, these radical reformation or rehabilitation programs have been going around across the Middle East, and there's been very little sort of scientific evidence that it takes. Right, the best you can
Yeah.
do is to try to convince many of these groups just not to act, rather than to actually change their beliefs.
Yeah. Sure.
Certainly in a short period of time.
Reminds me of the Sunni awakening. I mean, this is kind of wishful thinking that it's just going to, they're all of a sudden going to be on our side, and but the internal politics matter, and then what's going on in the borders too. I mean, even with Libya being so sparsely populated, you mentioned how Chad and another country and Sudan are also important in factoring into that too.
In terms of the sorry, I'm
Oh, I'm sorry. I just mean that even with Well, I was kind of relating it to Iraq in a extended way. The Sunni awakening and other efforts to try and during the surge to try and change the conflict over there ended up not solving the problem over there too, because we still end up having the Shia dominated
Mhm.
government there, which ends up oppressing the Sunnis and then support the rise for ISIS eventually after the Arab Spring too. So there's all these factors that we're trying to control for, but really a lot of it is wishful thinking.
And it's also, I think, critical to say that all this stuff goes back to the U.S. political system and the
Yeah,
conflict between the right and the left.
yeah,
And then two ideologies, and I one of my sort of favorite sort of summary lines is that American foreign policy has become a sort of an instrument of American self-harm,
yeah,
um, and vice, and our politics is pushing policies that don't help, certainly don't advance American interests abroad. I mean, it's this vicious circle.
yeah,
And then you've got situations like, I mean, as I started out this salon piece, where you've got people like, there were situations like, where President Biden goes to Saudi Arabia and tries to get some concessions out of the Saudis to help us with control inflation, to make up for the oil supplies that have been from Russia that are under sanction, etc. And I think that the Saudis basically look at that as sort of both a bit of an insult and a sign of weakness.
yeah,
Um, and they realize, I mean, everybody in the region realizes, regardless of which country it is, that the United States the way that we can influence American the policy in the region is to tie it back to domestic political concerns.
all
And
right.
that's again an argument for American policy to be based on, at least to insulate the professional bureaucracies from politicization. So at least you have some kind of consistent long-term reference point for what are American interests abroad, and how are we, this is the writ large intelligence community's assessment of what our interests are. The politicians can take that as they may, but at least there's a record of it, and they can be heard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also you point out pretty methodically too that there's this response in 2012 with the Romney campaign trying to call out Obama for not calling it a terrorist attack, but then you also have a few years later with Hillary Clinton's emails being released that it kind of breathes new life into this controversy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think the point there was that the Benghazi conflict became a vehicle for, again, all of these other, finding other issues upon which to fight.
Yeah,
So without the Benghazi committee, the Republican-led Benghazi committee, without their actions in both helping air the whole issue of the fact that Clinton had used a private server to handle her official emails, etc. That Without the Benghazi committee, that whole issue probably would not have
mm,
surfaced and been such a provocative thing. I mean, it's essentially the progression was the Benghazi political scandal occupied everyone's attention for 3 to 4 years, and then around 2015 people were getting tired of hearing that. It's a long time to be to put up with that. And then okay, so then it gets morphed into the conflict gets morphed into something else that looks like it's independent of the original controversy, but is actually just a different face of it.
mm,
Um, and then, of course, so you have the email thing. Really, you know, Clinton, I think, blamed that for more so blamed that for her loss to a large degree. But there was also the FBI director James Comey's comments about whether or not uh, Clinton's she would be uh, uh, the investigation would continue. And then there was the New York Times sort of opining that this was or suggesting that this was a criminal investigation, when in fact it had not been labeled
right.
as such by the FBI, and all of that stuff. And then of course you have the Russian cyber attacks which the Obama administration was downplaying at the time, but used the Benghazi material as feedstock for their own social media attacks. So I guess the point here being that throughout all of these issues that look like they're unconnected and were each blamed at one time for Hillary Clinton's loss and Donald Trump's win, all of them had Benghazi as a common denominator.
Right.
And a number of senior Obama officials had later, at least privately in interviews with me, had said, "Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Benghazi was a huge factor in ultimately in the 2016 election. You just have to look. The more you look, the more everything was colored by it. So
Is
you're
the
really,
lock is the locker up chant connected to that?
yeah. I think that the sort of the killery, the all of these phrases seem to sort of work on past accusations against conservative accusations against the Clintons and Hillary Clinton in particular, and mix them, intertwine them with Benghazi. So does Hillary refer to, what does it refer to? But clearly there's a Benghazi connection to that.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because there's kind of a connection between Whitewater scandal, right, and uh, quote unquote scandal, and then all the way through to the belief that the Clintons had people murdered in Arkansas for revealing that they were dealing crack cocaine with the Contras and the CIA. I mean, there's all of this
Right. But
conspiratorial
that's
thinking,
why.
right?
But that's why Benghazi was so perfect
Yeah,
as scandal material.
yeah,
And that's why I think, yeah, I keep thinking, what would have happened I'm going out on a limb here, but what would happen if the Obama administration had simply said, taken within a few days of the attack, taken the available evidence and actually pursued it, instead of running from it, and said, here's what happened. We're not going to dice words here. It was a terrorist attack. We're going to find the people responsible. And end of story. I mean, the typical reaction in those situations is the Republicans will, jump on board and not, that the other side will say,
yeah,
we accused of being, here they're doing something about it. But ironically, there was also the issue of the Bin Laden killing, where I think the Obama administration felt that with the Bin Laden killing, all of this stuff would disappear. But
yeah,
it didn't. It almost perversely ratcheted up the pressure. Craig Whitlock's book on the Afghanistan U.S. policy in Afghanistan, I thought was really eye-opening,
yeah,
because it explains, particularly with respect to the 2012 election, which is exactly the period we're looking at, how the Obama administration was sort of they knew that the surge was not going well, but the messaging was, things it was positive,
yeah,
and so I think one incident that was really sort of striking to me and was described by Scott Shane in his book on drone warfare,
mm,
was this, and various other sources, was this incident, 2009 underwear bomber incident,
yeah,
in which, that was the end Christmas Day of 2009, in which this Nigerian Al Qaeda recruit from, the recruiting process went through Yemen, was trying to blow himself up on a plane over Detroit, and the attack was foiled. But the Obama administration, the first instinct was, well, we don't want to talk about this because it's going to attract attention. We're just going to say we're going to take the high road there, and but internally, I think one of the lessons that was taken from that was, that was the power that those incidents had in terms of leverage for political attacks. And at least one of Obama's senior official aides was saying, or if not Obama himself, said that, essentially his second term was hanging in the balance over Detroit, and that was very
mm,
early on in
oh yeah,
the Obama administration. So then you fast forward to Benghazi and everything else that came between those 2 points, and all of the Republican, Romney in his campaign, cast Obama's Middle East diplomacy as the apology tour.
yeah,
Instead of giving it to those who would harm American interests, Obama was reaching out. So all of this, you start to try to put yourself in the heads of the people who are sort of managing from very different perspectives and not as a unified force necessarily, the optics around Benghazi, and you can see why they want that, wants to deal with this.
Yeah.
It's just, this is the 3 a.m. phone call times 10.
Right, and I like how you parse out how really so much of this has to do with the way that they could have responded to it immediately. You've gone through various examples in this discussion too, but in the book, you identify a lot of key points when it could have been messaged in a much more honest way, and there would be less gaps for the other side to exploit. But what's crazy is that it's turned into this crazy thing that conspiratorial thinking, where people believe that that Hillary and Obama were involved in actually deliberately putting these Americans in harm's way, and they are so adamant about that, and it's gone into the QAnon phase too.
And Pizzagate and the rest of the stuff, which if you're reading the descriptions of this attack against Speaker Pelosi's husband in San
Right,
Francisco, one of the articles I read, that some of the formative experiences of this individual were QAnon and Pizzagate.
right.
So it's and I have to say, the one part of Ben Rhodes's memoir, 2018 memoir, that I resonated very strongly with me was this idea that something broke with Benghazi. That from his perspective, of course, it was
Mm,
all the Republicans' fault, but
yeah,
that that this degree of normal rules didn't apply. But I'm not even quite sure that was the. I mean, there were so many warnings of that was in process.
yeah,
Um, so
no doubt. Well, and it is kind of a different attack too, because there had been terrorist attacks against the U.S., the Beirut bombing, of course, but then there had been cases where they had burned the embassy to the ground, like in Pakistan in '79, and other cases. And there's all these other attacks that you talk about too, like in Tunis and in Yemen and Egypt as well, around our embassies, and people are dying actually in some of those cases too. But the way that Benghazi played out was different, right? There were 20 guys with AK-47s who went to the consulate itself and attacked the ambassador, right?
But if I could jump in, I mean,
Yeah,
part of the other problematic elements of the Benghazi thing is that if the more you look into the details around who was present and actually and what happened just before in Egypt and the mechanics of the attack against the embassy there and those in Tunis shortly thereafter, there are a huge amount of connections between all of these groups, and they are
mm,
no, I mean, there are people within the intelligence community who know all about these connections, but it's significant because you have to ask yourself whether, I mean, there were direct connections with the now successor to Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, and his brother, who was in Egypt, who was allegedly behind the organization of the demonstration that led to the attack in the U.S. on the U.S. embassy on the 11th, the same day. And you had various senior members of affiliated Al Qaeda groups and affiliates lurking around in Benghazi and various places during the attack. And you had the statements by Ayman al-Zawahiri himself just the day before the attack, referencing a Libyan Al Qaeda member, his number two, who had been assassinated by the U.S. in a drone strike several months before, and calling on his followers to avenge that attack. There are too many things there that are just that suggest that there is, even if the attack wasn't precisely coordinated many months in advance, that there was an effort to use the video. And here I'm openly informedly speculating
yeah,
that in fact there was this idea that was persistent, that that they could use instrumentalize this crazy video to sort of create conditions that would allow for a kind of a multi-pronged kind of disruption that would advance of some of these groups in various countries in the Middle East, but Libya in particular, because this was a very fragile. I mean, add to the confluence of critical uh, uh, sort of turning points. The Libyan transition was at risk. at this point. It had been a year since the intervention, and the radical groups were making progress in the east. And here was this opportunity to strike. And I think,
Right.
and the other bit, if I could mention, is that I think that one of the reasons that this happened and we were vulnerable to the attack was that there was a fundamental conflict between but what the Obama administration itself was prepared to do in terms of quote unquote state building, and what individuals like Chris Stevens, even to a degree Hillary Clinton, wanted to do in terms of assuring that that Benghazi did not fall to radicals, and that ultimately the intervention led to a better future for Americans. I think that's where Chris Stevens was sort of pushing the limit with the endorsement of the State Department, but entered into a zone by doing so where there was not the bureaucratic backup that he needed to do that in a safer way. And
Yeah.
according to Hillary Clinton, when I interviewed with her, her point was, look, Chris Stevens was doing really, really risky stuff from the very start of when he was the envoy to the transitional government. He was there essentially on, with a few bodyguards, and running around a city where we really didn't know what was going on, and trying to set up an initial sort of liaison post. So her point was that the risk was just part of the game. I mean, that he was and many other people believe this too, as do I, that Stevens really was a very courageous figure. He went into these situations knowing full well that there were huge risks. The irony, of course, is that his death essentially reversed all of the things that he wanted to accomplish in Libya, particularly, and some.
And of course, his final words that he wrote were to that effect too, right? To the violent situation that he understood was in the city.
Yeah. And one of the things that I objected to and wanted to clarify in this book as well is that role that Chris Stevens was really a major actor, not only in getting the U.S. government to yes on the intervention, which I think he had a strong input there as one of the few people who understood Libya in the bureaucracies, and so he wasn't a cardboard figure. I mean, he was on the ground, trying to get Washington to pay attention to a region and a city that he felt was critical to the stability of Libya as a whole. When we essentially the international community's focus had already dissipated.
Right.
Um, and yeah, and there's a striking, in many of the interviews that I had with some other of his more direct colleagues and friends, there's this sense, and certainly I felt that he was expressing this to me a few months before the attack when we met in Washington, was that in some ways he felt an obligation, given his previous input into steering into the decision to intervene, that he almost felt like it was a personal issue that he had to go out and take those risks to try to get more attention. And I
Yeah.
think and I think much of the speculation after the attack was, why on earth would that here's this rogue ambassador who's out there doing crazy stuff and clearly wasn't paying attention to the danger he was in. I think that's really a gross mischaracterization.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, yeah.
That's a great way to put it too, and I think in a lot of ways the book is a good homage to Chris Stevens, and there's so many good parts of this book that I hope it gets a lot more attention, because especially when you have something like a movie like 13 Hours that it kind of symbolizes, it's almost like with Mark Bowden's Black Hawk Down. His book interviews people on both sides. He's interviewing Somalis and he's interviewing Americans, and then the movie emphasizes just the American side, and that's an unfortunate part, I think, that can come out of that, because it's not just about what's happening in the city of Benghazi to those four Americans. It's this longer history leading up to it, which applies to Libya today as well, 10 years later, and it applies to all of our other interventions in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I try to explain, not in overwhelming detail, but at least enough to get a sense of the immediate, that there was indeed a Benghazi effect on U.S. Policy and outcomes in Syria, Yemen, other places in the region. that there are these connections, that what happened in Libya, while we sort of like to think that Libya is sort of a marginal to U.S. interests in the Middle East, a certain degree of neglect will in fact turn a marginal situation into a critical situation.
Right. And it was the result of neglect to begin with, as because we were focused on other places in the Middle East, right?
Exactly.
And
Right.
and then it makes us more reluctant to move into places like Syria afterwards,
Exactly.
which is a complete
And
mess
this
now.
and interestingly, it's interesting that I interviewed a whole slew of U.S. officials and people who were, again, had different um, uh, contributions to the or interfaces on the attack, and they a lot of them, a number of people went out of their way to describe this Benghazi effect, that's sort of become the it's not a known term, but that's one that's been used by a number of people close to this, which is that there was this sort of already this hesitation to get involved in deeply in anything in the region, but the risk aversion just went after Benghazi, just skyrocketed, so that we and say Ambassador Patterson, among others, who then became Assistant Secretary for the Near East afterwards, after being ambassador in Cairo during that attack, described it as a total disaster for American foreign policy and diplomacy. That we, basically, and the dot 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 is that we essentially pulled our spies and our diplomats behind high walls, and were much less aware of what was going on in the field. In places like Yemen, for example, the origins of the growth of Iran's relationship with the Houthi rebels was not sort of flagged as an immediate issue, with disastrous consequences, and we've relied more on drone strikes and things like this. So that risk aversion was what became kind of took the United States out of the region. We were already sort of had our foot out, but it had all these other not being present has a cost. Uh,
Yeah.
Particularly if you look at things now like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think you can actually, I make the argument that there is a line that you can draw from the United States sort of abdication in Libya and Syria, which around the Benghazi attack. I mean, that was
Yeah.
sort of punctuation mark there that convinced Putin that the United States was not going to stand up, and the rest of the international community was not going to fight him if he took first Crimea and then Ukraine. All of
Yeah.
these things are part of a sort of a growing process, and then we try to come back, as you indicated before, and fix the problem. But we've already ceded a lot of ground, and it's very
Yeah.
hard to make it up.
It is a perpetual problem, definitely. Trying to solve something like Ukraine or Crimea in 2014, and Libya in this case. I remember actually a friend of mine from Syria who was making the point he wishes that the United States would intervene in Syria, and I said, yeah, but how are we supposed to deal with a Russian-backed regime, plus Hezbollah and Iran are there too. Um, and he said, yeah, but you guys did so good in Libya too. And he was just thinking about 2011 with the NATO intervention there, and but the but cleaning up afterwards, and especially dealing with all the different factions that you talk about. We haven't even gotten into all of that. Very much, which your readers will find out that when you account for all these different interests that are in Libya, which have a deep history there and in other countries, then it seems like it'd be a very difficult juggling act for us to figure out which side to emphasize and which side to bolster, because some of them are extremists. Some of them have been tortured with the assistance of the backing of the United States too, right? Like
Mhm.
Belhaj. This is a very important character that you bring up. And
It's a
yeah,
striking scene, I'm sure you recall, with Senator McCain, where he goes and,
yeah,
Senator McCain had, of course, was a POW and had this very deeply affecting experience there. And of course, he empathized with the fact that here are these people who had been, grossly mistreated by the United, regardless of whatever else they may have done,
yeah,
and went and apologized publicly, almost quasi publicly. But without seeming to understand some of the ways in which, if not Belhaj himself, then the groups that he was attached to were working against American interests.
right. And
Um,
of course, you point out though how it's not just about the United States, right? When we start to intervene in a place like Libya, that or Afghanistan or Iraq, that there are these local interests, these near enemy interests, right? Like they're trying to deal with. Even though they might have global interests, they're much more concerned about what's going on in their own country, right? People like Belhaj, for example, he's interested in resisting against Gaddafi, and then eventually changes and decides to be kind of on his side too, right? Try to work with him a little bit. That it's things like that that we can't really account for very well.
well, yes, and I guess the lessons here are, one, that the more information we have, more informed decisions we can make, and we
Yeah,
can, going back to the point in which we're trying to figure out what to do about Gaddafi's threats to eastern Libya and Benghazi. Um, we can, the more tethered we are to expert advice,
yeah,
the more we can make reasonable, lasting decisions, and ones which are, I mean, again, taking a step back, U.S. Policies toward particularly Libya is a great case study. It's just like this oscillating: we're friends with these people, we're enemies with them, we're friends with them, we're enemies. There's no consistency there,
yeah,
um, and each administration really seems to have forgotten what happened in the previous one. So that's a structural problem, and I think a lot of this stuff actually just comes down to the fact that a number of our, particularly after 9/11, when the Bush administration started to really kind of engineer a lot of the bureaucracies to serve their own political interests, you start to lose this coherence or independence within the bureaucracies, which is so critical to trying to keep things on some, to prevent really bad decisions.
yeah,
And I think that's, and then you have, of course, the Obama administration again coming back in and saying, okay, well, we are ostensibly more interested in building these resources back up, but we're afraid, our primary fear is that the Republicans will attack us. We have to build defensive mechanisms that will also have unfortunately, the effect of distancing ourselves from those resources. So again, the Obama administration came in, and you can understand where this came from, but they're in this kind of bulwark mentality, where you're either kind of with us or against us in our own bubble.
yeah,
Um, and then Hillary Clinton comes into this, where she's not really perceived as really with us or against us. She's sort of
yeah,
suspect. Um, yeah, it's just, you just, the United States cannot continue on a trajectory as a world power, a responsible world power. Forget the democracy question, which is obviously very important, with this kind of dysfunction and not addressing it. And I think
right,
the way to address it, in part, I mean, of course, it's such a complicated problem, but the one has to find some ways and some zone of bipartisan agreement on the fact that certain resources are in the American, need to be preserved and strengthened for American interests, and and go from there.
right.
It's sort of hard to argue that a strong intelligence agency is not in American interests. I don't think anybody would really disagree with that.
Right.
But
No, I completely agree, and I would love to. be able to continue this conversation maybe at another time too, to kind of build on what's happened to Libya since then too, because that's a whole other thing. But I have to cut off right now, and thank you so much for being on the program, Ethan Chorin. I encourage all my listeners to pick up his book Benghazi: A New History of the Fiasco That Pushed America and Its World to the Brink, because that subtitle right there is so indicative of the significance of studying this history.
Well, thank you very much I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. I always love these conversations. I learn so much more. I'm motivated to kind of go an extra step by interviewing the author, and then other people get to be exposed to it too.
Well, best of luck, and look forward to following your other episodes.
Great. Thank you, Ethan. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye bye.